all good.
Excited on this episode of More Good Drinks as we pursue people who have the greatest jobs in whiskey. It's time to have a conversation with my good friend Seamus Carroll from the Whisky Club in Australia, and appropriate because it is Tasmanian Whisky Week and that's where the Whisky Club is based, even though we are celebrating a kind of the 1 year birthday of the Whisky Club being in New Zealand as well. So there's something for everyone in this episode. Seamus, we first met gallivanting around the South Island. There were some helicopters, there were some good dinners, and there were a few really special cask selections.
Yes.
But why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are behind all the glamour?
I'd be very, very happy to. You've flashed me back immediately to sitting in that helicopter with someone sat next to the pilot saying, I want to feel the G's. And that was the second most memorable part of that trip to the South Island. Number one being some of those delicious casks we found. But no, yes, Seamus, I sit as the GM of the Whisky Club. Very, very happily have been here for I'm in my 6th year in this business, and a diehard whiskey nerd by all metrics. I mean, having come into the industry via what I consider to be one of the most fun routes, looking after Glendronach, Benrick, and Glenglasser in this Antipodean side of the world, it was just an absolute godsend. And then fell into the Tassie industry as well, fell in love with it down here, as I think so many people have by walking into a cellar door, meeting a distiller, having them threaten to make us do the mashing by hand, and going, wow, you can really touch whiskey. How cool, how cool. And I've been in it ever since. Down here in Tassie now, running the club at what feels like a breakneck pace. And Tash, as you say, we're celebrating 12 months in New Zealand, or 13 months now. And our second year is going to be even bigger than our first.
So for people who don't know what the Whisky Club is, my too long didn't read version is it's effectively a whiskey subscription club where incredible whiskies that you wouldn't otherwise find on a shelf get presented to the members month on month. They choose whether they're in or out, and there's a bunch of other options that come along with it. And through that, an incredible community of like over 35,000 members now. Is that about it?
Yeah. Oh, look, absolutely. And I think when we first met, that was absolutely bang on. The thing that has changed is this incredible pace of growth has just gone and gone and gone. So these days we're well above 40,000 members. We're the world's biggest whiskey club. We're only in Australia and New Zealand, which is insane. And there is so much history to whiskey clubs and whiskey communities on this side of the planet that I do think we should dig into at some point in this conversation. But yeah, we're pumping along. We partner with amazing distilleries to do official bottlings that we think really suit whiskey lovers over here. And we work with them to show off what we find so interesting about these distilleries. And I think so rarely do you get to go to a whiskey maker and say, hey, we want to make a lot of whiskey. We want to give you a lot of time to plan. What have you been working on? What crazy ideas have you got for us? And so often, as you would know, Tash, in this industry, it's last minute, last chance saloon. God, we got to move these casks. We need to know what we're doing. With the gift of time and with the scale of having so many incredible members, we can pull off some pretty outrageous whiskey procurement.
So let's talk about the job itself, because up till this point, people you wouldn't blame them for thinking, okay, one of the greatest jobs in whiskey has to be flying around the world, choosing casks, working with incredible distillers, tasting a lot of whiskey, but there's got to be more to it than that, right? Or are you actually living the dream? So break it down for us, maybe. It's not just all the glamour. What actually goes into the job of running the Whisky Club and making great selections for members?
That's a great question. And I'm playing into the facade by joining you with a very selected background. For anyone who can't see, there is a number of cask samples behind me. And you're right. I think that is enormously the idea that people get when you do come into whiskey conversations. And it is a really big part of the job. But so much of it is actually about partnering with distilleries in ways that they work and kind of meeting them in the middle. And something that, and Tash, you would have seen this across all your years in the industry. No two distilleries operate the same way. And it's meant that this business that is kind of growing and growing on our side has just become this multifaceted thing. Our relationship with a tiny independent distillery in New Zealand is completely different to our relationship with Pernod Ricard, the beasts behind
Mhm.
Chivas Regal. And we need to enable as much of that flexibility as possible. My role within the club has kind of always started at the romantic end of it. And I think all of our staff should start at the romantic end of it because it is the whiskey and it is the community. And really, if that's our guiding light, then we'll always hopefully make the right decisions and back the right horses. But so much of it now is about facilitating the team doing incredibly well. So we've got a great whiskey team. We've got a head of whiskey creation in Scotland who's a very important right hand for me. Who's doing the QA on a lot of car sampling and a lot of the digging around Scotland, finding things that people maybe aren't aware of yet, but really should be.
Mm.
We've got operations teams who, work on all the logistics and the packaging and make sure that the whiskey actually arrives on time. And that's one of the really unique things about our business is you can't miss a delivery day. It's the whiskey of the month. It's not an optional exercise, right? If we
Mhm.
miss, we get 3,000 people in New Zealand calling us saying, "Here's my whiskey this month," and we can't have that. And then we have an incredible customer service team down here. And look, it was incredibly complimentary. I used to work for a fellow by the name of Craig Johnson, who is now our head of whiskey creation. I used to work for him at the Ben Rick Distilling Company, and he then went on to become the Macallan blender and then joined the club. And I still remember what he said on his first visit to the office. He met with the team for a week. I kind of had that first catch up with him as he'd done the rounds and said, "This is the first business I've ever worked for where every single person is a whiskey geek."
Mhm.
And if we can sit here and enable that kind of culture internally, well, gosh, it's going to come out, isn't it? And it's going to reach the members.
That is actually there's a really unique space because there's nothing like the Whiskey Club as it exists in our part of the world. There's nothing else like it anywhere else in the world that I've seen or even heard of. And that component around the whiskey geekery, I think, is one of the things that perhaps makes it so unique because it's where all of the barriers fall down. I don't know if you spend a lot of time on WhiskeyTube.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right? So and it feels a little bit like even when I put the podcast on YouTube, sometimes I feel a little bit like I'm moving into somebody else's space because like the whiskey enthusiasts and the whiskey tubers, they're very passionate and they're really, really passionate, super fans of whiskey. It feels like in the Whiskey Club, there's obviously the commercial side of working with the business and then also working with the distilleries to make it all happen. But at the heart, it kind of feels like whiskey enthusiasts and business meet in the middle in a way that perhaps they can't in other roles in whiskey. Like when you were looking after Brown Forman's, collection of Scotch whiskey brands, there's always that here's the brand and then here's the consumer. Whereas Whiskey Club, it all kind of comes together because you guys are as much customers of your own product as you are developing it, right?
Yeah, you've absolutely nailed that, and it kind of shows in the way this business has grown, like in headcount. We hire so often members of the club who are just hardcore passionate people who have their own skills and their own career backgrounds that just want to come and do it in the whiskey world. We operate relatively simply commercially to make sure we can just deliver awesome whiskey to people and not add too much fluff. I think when we're partnering with any of the distilleries that we're working with, we're basically trying to tie up either one of three versions of releasing a whiskey for us. We're either going to be finding a distillery that you've not heard of that you absolutely should have and really shining a light on something that is incredible and really deserves to be grown. We're taking your old favorite whiskey, maybe the first distilleries you fell in love with, the Fiddicks, the Aberlours, the Glenlivets, that maybe you've fallen out of love with a little bit and maybe they
Mm-hmm.
don't produce the whiskies that always hit your palate. And because we can come along with a bit of scale, we can actually go to the whiskey maker and say, what do you want to make? Do you want to bring it back to a bit of a geekier heart or do a little bit more on ABV or show off a certain little trait of the distillery? And number three is that really tailoring it to what the whiskey maker wants to do. And we often find that in years of partnering with whiskey makers, I always go to Sandy Hislop, the man behind the Glenlivet and Aberlour blending, up until very recently, because every conversation with him was one of, we would love to really explore a release with this distillery. And he'd go, amazing. I've been thinking about this for the last 10 years and no one's asked me that question. Here
Mm.
are all of my ideas. And suddenly you're picking through a golden list. So it's always should be one of those three. And if we're doing our jobs right, it should be a very healthy mix of all three. Um, but I think the wall behind me and the collection of brands, whether it be Glenmorangie or Glendronach or a tiny distillery like Rase, I mean, it should be a bit of a journey.
I think there is something really, the hard commercial reality of whiskey production is that, oftentimes particularly in those bigger houses, you're making decisions about what you release, that as a whiskey maker, you have to make decisions about what will have broad appeal, what sits within the distillery character style, what sits within the ultimate program of,
Yeah,
what's been laid down. And yet it is, as you say, right, it's the buying power of the whiskey club to be able to say, right, actually, we can guarantee enough bottles of this will move. So what is it that you'd really like to do? And so I imagine there's probably a lot of whiskey makers who are pretty excited when you guys kind of come knocking on the door and they go, okay, great, yeah, this is the one. And maybe they've even got some. Do you get to a point where you work with certain distilleries and they've got ideas and they've got projects kind of lining up in the pipeline where they're excited to get them out?
absolutely, absolutely. I think, and this probably comes back to your original question about what is the actual role, and so much of it is meeting with those whiskey makers and facilitating whatever version of creativity they really want to show off. And I mean, we had Rachel Barry down here in Tassie in the office
Our
just
queen,
yesterday.
our
Our
queen.
queen, the Honourable Dr. Rachel Barry
Hmm.
of Glendronach, Benriach, and Glenglasser fame for anyone who's listening and unfamiliar, which should be no one because she is our queen. And we've been releasing whiskies with her for the last 7 or 8 years. Basically, as soon as Billy Walker handed over the
Mm.
distilleries, we set to work. And in the last 5 years, it's been a real journey of working directly with her and hearing how she wants to work. And something that we discovered kind of halfway through was we were working on a release and we were talking through possible cast types. And she just stopped us for a second and said, look, I've run Glendronach. We can throw 100 casts here and 100 casts there, and it can be a punt and an experiment for us. I've got countless versions of this. We're not stuck in one version. I want to show you the one that's ready today because I've got three more in the back of my head that'll be ready tomorrow and the day after and the day after.
Hmm.
And it's meant that we end up with this like 5 year pipeline of absolutely insane whiskies. But then the contrary is, and I'm blanking on his last name, but the former Glen Grant master distiller, Malcolm something,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
uh,
Yep.
he um he sat down with us for our Glen Grant special release, and this is back in 2022, 2023. And we had a great conversation with him. He was on his way toward retiring, and he said, the thing I'm proudest about this distillery is the way it's run and the cleanliness and the efficiency and how much flavor we get out of malt. So he wanted to show off a cask strength 13-year-old
Hmm.
in first world bourbon. No fluff, no
Yeah.
no like
Just
story,
here's
no
our
one.
character
Yeah, just
straight down the line.
unfiltered, undiluted. This is
Hmm.
pure Glen Grant. And it's one of
Hmm.
the best Glen Grants I've ever had. You know, it's
Mm.
not hiding behind anything.
Yeah. And there's probably, I mean, I'm making some gross assumptions because we don't have the whiskey makers on the line, and that's kind of some of the fun of it. Because I think oftentimes there is that great romanticism fueled in part by whiskey makers in Tasmania and New Zealand and Australia and other, where they are small and you can shake their hand and you can get in touch and they'll tell you absolutely everything about ferment through to distillation and maturation. But you get into one of those larger houses, and I think Dr. Bill, right, is the best example of this, where, the first thing Dr. Bill will tell you is an inappropriate joke. And the second thing he'll tell you is whatever marketing is trying to get him to talk about, this month that he's not happy about. Like he lives in that real tension between here's the juice and the liquid and what I'm trying to do, and then here's what marketing want me to say. And that can be a real challenge, right? Because marketing's job is to help sell the whiskey. You guys kind of take that away a little bit because you're marketing the whiskey that your members, or you trust your members are really going to love. How do you keep on top of that consumer desire, or where your members are responding? Is it what they've responded to in the past? Is it what they tell you? Like, how do you get a read on that palate without just
It's
being like, I'll drink this?
Yeah, which inevitably part of it is like paneling whiskies and obviously reviewing them. But it's probably a bit of a long answer, but indulge me slightly because
Okay, well, if it's a
if
long answer, I'm pouring a drink.
yeah, fair, fair, fair.
So one of my favorite whiskey club whiskies that came out this year in New Zealand. I am a member, and for very good reason. What I particularly loved about this bottling, I'll say, and then you can get back to your story, is just how old school it is. In the last 12 months, I've fallen in love with much older styles of sherry cask, Highland and Speyside whiskies that kind of call back to when I first started drinking single malts, and I was, very young, so like a couple of years ago. Anyway, back to you.
Yeah, now I want to talk about the Kibok 15. It's such a cool whiskey. They've done such a good job. Really good example of like doesn't get enough attention. Is making amazing whiskey. I mean, 15-year-old heavily sherried, heavily peated whiskey is almost unheard of. On Ireland, that would cost an arm and a leg.
Mhm.
We're getting it from the Highlands. I can't let you have a dram on your own. I'll talk about this later though, because otherwise I'll never answer one of your questions.
Yeah. Okay.
So how do we stay on top of things? It is a few things. Of course, we have a whiskey panel of people who have incredible palates who review about 900 pitches a year for kind of quality and consistency. And for anyone watching, that is part of the wall behind me. There is all of those releases. And that's sometimes cast samples, sometimes work in projects. And we have a really simple rating system. I think the best rating systems are often simple. A 5 out of 10 is, would I drink this?
Mhm.
A 6 out of 10 is, would I buy another glass of this? A 7 out of 10 is, would I buy a bottle of this? And really for us, you need to be landing in 8 out of 10. I need multiple bottles of this immediately for us to even be considering pushing forwards with something. But as you say, it's not only defined by what we think tastes good, it's also defined by what we think people would be really interested in seeing. It's a few things. We do virtual tastings with each whiskey maker after each whiskey release. And that's a wonderful forum to have members giving their opinions directly to the whiskey maker and directly to us as a team on what they thought of the whiskey, what they would love to see. Often in those conversations, we do get to sit with the whiskey maker and say, what would you think of a rum cask? What would you think of a 14-year-old in bourbon? What would you think of this or that? And we do see a lot of really interesting dialogue from the members on that side. But then the kind of end of it is always just going to be those conversations in person. I mean, I think we're all whiskey geeks. We live in the community. We either go to our own whiskey events, of course, but we also go to everyone else's. And I think
Mhm.
sometimes in the whiskey industry, and you see this in some distilleries, gets to be a little bit of, I won't say Kool-Aid, I don't think it's the right analogy, but you do get a little bit of everyone's drinking their own whiskey and sometimes they're not drinking enough of everyone else's. You can sometimes get a bit of settler palate or a little bit blind to what the rest of the industry is doing so well. So if you can go to other people's tastings or even other people's just get-togethers around and share a dram and see what they're really excited about, I think you learn so much just in those little conversations and those little home truths that I'll have in a conversation in a bar in Auckland at 9 p.m. I was going to say 1 a.m. 9 p.m. sensible
We're
times.
sensible, and
Yeah,
we
we're
we
sensible.
support responsible service around here.
We absolutely do. You have so much value of hearing why that bartender is so excited by that dram. And equally, being in a snug in the middle of Tasmania in a snowy field, having a dram of something that'll warm you up. I mean, the number of times you revisit Glenfiddich 12 and go, actually, I can see why this is so popular as well. And consuming kind of all of
Mhm.
it. But I'm very conscious. I read this book years ago, but it was published 25 years ago. And it was like the up and coming trends in Scotch. This is going to be the future of the Scotch whiskey industry. And it was a real summary of what was on trend in that moment. And Tash, I'll give you one guess what the number one trend was called out by it.
Well, the cynic in me wants to say women are going to start drinking whiskey, being called out as a trend, because apparently that one's still like breaking news.
I'm thrilled to say that wasn't what it was, but
Yeah.
yeah,
20, okay, if I'm putting myself back 25 years ago, trends in whiskey, single malt was still on the rise. Um, uh, it's, there's so many. It's really challenging. I mean, Japanese whiskey would have been starting to emerge. Yeah. I don't know.
yeah,
Hit me. Reveal it all.
This is the incredibly frustrating thing is you've given a bunch of good answers from someone who lives in the industry. This book was written, but I won't call it out, but it was written by someone who's a real industry leader. And the byline, the number one stop was cask finishing. People are really getting into sherry casks, the cask finishing. The industry's a circle, man. Like we're still doing what we were doing 25 years ago. Someone's moved liquid from one cask to another and we're blown
Yeah.
away by it. But
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in that, we've gotten so much better at doing it as well. But it doesn't mean that that's all that there is in depth to whiskey. So I think it's a real funny time for us right now.
Still, if it's still on point 25 years later, can you call it a trend, or is it just that's how we make whiskey?
Yeah, I think maybe there's not that many whiskey trends. They also mention things like playing with germination, playing with fermentation, playing with
Mm-hmm.
different barley strains. It's like, yeah, that's the top three that someone would probably say today as well.
Yeah, I feel like, yeah, yeah. And then underneath that is a big commercial question around yield.
Mm,
I think maybe one of the trends that is in whiskey today that is not that wouldn't have been around 25 years ago is trying to predict consumer trends. I think 25 years ago, Scotch whiskey in particular was what it was, and it was still riding high on
mm.
finding that single malt audience and continuing in that trajectory right before we kind of, it was post the 80s. It was kind of like, okay, we're coming back. Everything's, going to be good times. But now I think probably there's more time in whiskey industry spent trying to look at what consumer trends are going to be and how people will get grabbed back in. The Kuboko in 15.
Yes.
So this is, I guess, maybe an example of that conversation where, things go back around. Because for me, that earthy component of how much there's so much structure in this whiskey, but it's not just coming from the cask. There is a remarkable presence of grain going on. But then you've also got the sherry influence. There's lots of grit in here. For me, it just feels really, it feels like it's telling me a story. I close my eyes, I smell it, and without being too romantic, I can picture myself, just on the road with that tall stand of trees going right by the distillery and exactly how it smells, kind of at 9 o'clock in the morning when the earth is still a bit damp and there's the odd fire chimney, going off in the distance. But
Yep.
anyway, love it. What have you chosen to drink?
Uh, great question. So I've gone with
Yeah.
a wonderful little Ben Romick. This is the upcoming whiskey of the month. So shame on me, but it's also kind of my favorite whiskey at the moment, which makes this incredibly easy. So it's a Golden Promise barley expression of Ben Romick. They've only done a handful
Mm-hmm.
of Golden Promise casks in the past, but they started experimenting with it back in 1999. Um, for anyone who doesn't know Golden Promise barley, it can sound like incredibly geeky, 10 layers of nerdiness in, but it's kind of easy to distill down, pardon the pun. Basically in the 1950s, going into the 60s, the Scotch industry discovered a new grain variation, which was called Golden Promise, and immediately fell in love with it. Had a good yield, but more importantly, had incredible spirit texture, gave you really
Mm.
solid weight, and gave you like a really bright, creamy, full mouthfeel. And for anyone who's a diehard Scotch collector, 70s, they still have this incredible viscosity that really sits. And I'm not talking about ones bottled in 2025, but even the ones bottled 10 years after distillation, way back then, they still hold up and they have this incredible DNA. So the barley strain GP Golden Promise kind of fell out of vogue. It wasn't the highest yielding. Crops needed to be rotated and the budgets got cut and
We
people
might say at
invested
this
in.
point, unfulfilled promises. Hopes were high.
Absolutely. Hopes are incredibly high. And thanks to, some common sense things, farmers need to rotate crops, but they're replaced with lower flavor, higher yielding, more
Mm.
efficient grain types. And it did change the way that whiskey tastes. It's one of the hundreds of small things that have affected what we're drinking now in 2026. Grain type was then only carried on by Macallan and Glengoyne.
Mm.
And from about 1992, 1993, they didn't even use it 100%. They basically dosed it in so they could carry some of that viscous, creamy DNA, but also keep up with the industry trends. The Ben Romick guys saw this in 1999 and went, this grain is amazing. They did some trial runs of it at very small maltsters where they couldn't get their malts back and did them as test releases, mostly in bourbon casks back in like 2006, 2007. I'm sure Michael at Whiskey Galore has a few bottles of those experimental runs because they're very cool whiskies, but they're moment in
Mm-hmm.
time, incomplete thought whiskies. Anyway, forward to 2 years ago, we're visiting a bunch of distilleries around Speyside and make it up to Ben Romick. And the distilling team are there looking very, very excited. And that's always the best opportunity. We had Murdo, the head distiller, in the room, basically just looking very perky. And this was after 20 minutes of walking around the distillery and him telling us how much he loves Ben Romick and bourbon casks, which, as a brief side note, I've never met a master distiller that doesn't like their spirit in bourbon casks because it's the least cask influence.
Yeah, yeah. What's the softest, gentlest pair of hands I can put my spirit into
Yeah.
to wreck it the least? There it is.
Exactly. And we came into this room and we got a little cast sample. I bet it's behind me somewhere that said 2011, 2012 distilled, GP, 100% sherry. And Murdo was looking at me very excited. I was like, "You've just told me you don't like sherry casks. This is the exception. This is the exception." It's 100% golden promise barley distilled to Ben Romick's normal specs, which means it's got that kind of faint, funky note that the best Ben
Mm-hmm.
Romicks have from the spirit. Really clean sherry casks, not at all sulfured, full butt maturation, full Oloroso.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, they presented the sample at 46. And often in these situations, you end up trialing samples at a lot of ABVs to make them work. But 46 was really where this whiskey sung. So I'm having that one. It's a creamy, delicious delight. I haven't actually drank any yet. I've been sniffing it this entire time. It's got this burnt rice pudding nose to
Mm-hmm.
it from
Mm-hmm.
that creamy viscosity,
Yeah, nice.
which, Tash, I know this is just teasing because you haven't had this yet, but we'll make sure you get a bottle. And yeah, I'm going to say cheers.
Yeah, Slange of A. You may not know this, but Ben Romick is absolutely in my top 5 of just drams I cannot get enough of. And partly because I don't love every single one, right? But objectively, it's incredibly skillful whiskey and such a great showcase of how they play with what they're doing. So, their contrast series with high enzyme and just there's some really, really thoughtful and intelligent, but then also playful whiskey that comes out of Ben Romick, and I am just I'm a bit of a mega fan around that. So that was a nice choice. That was a nice choice for you.
Yeah.
Well, like that's great. That's awesome. You mentioned just before, and I think it would be worthwhile diving into. We can talk about obviously, the community as a whole and those online tastings, and I think the New Zealand community is just starting to kind of form little hubs around the Whiskey Club, which is nice. We've had
Yeah.
we've had a few nights here for a where there's been a virtual tasting and we've kind of filled the couches up and everyone throws in.
Love it.
There is, before we dive into that piece of it, you were talking a little bit about kind of, the history and the connection to Scotch and some of those pieces, such a large number of members, the largest whiskey club in the world, and, how some of those clubs, have emerged over time. Something that's I've been doing a little research into for another project, which is not to talk about here, but just down low for another project. But something I've been doing a lot of research into is and it starts a little bit with the number of distillation licenses that actually happened in Australia first before they happened anywhere else in the world. Obviously, that strong contingent of where some of the people who were getting those licenses and making whiskey in Australia came from, which is, the UK, Scotland. And it
Mm.
ties very much into, for a long time, New Zealand actually was one of the largest Scotch export markets in the world per capita because of the incredible hub of Scotch-loving people that were
Yeah.
here, right? Edinburgh of the South is Dunedin, and Christchurch is, probably very close to modern-day Glasgow, give or take a port or two. But I think as, there's something really there's a synergy, I guess, that I want to unpack with you around Tasmania is absolutely, and I've been sort of speaking about this, I think Tasmania is now absolutely in its third wave of modern whiskey and Tasmanian whiskey being really its own, sort of stamp in the world within a bigger Australasian story. And obviously the New Zealand piece is humming along, but all the way, whether it's, we've got Waiheke whiskey and Pocono, I know you guys have done a lot of work with them, and then the really significant Australian brands that you're working with, but all the way through, Scotch just continues to pull people in. And
Yes.
and I'm interested in, I guess, your take on how that history and future kind of meld together for the melting pot of whiskey community that we have nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's kind of divine out of two things. We have this incredible heritage, and I mean, both kind of coming from the United Kingdom backgrounds in New Zealand and Australia. We inevitably have really high immigration from Irish and from Scottish, more Irish on the Australian side, more Scottish on the New Zealand side, but enormous population of people with those backgrounds. And I think there is always that kind of parochial familiarity to the whiskey. But I actually think, and I never thought of it like this until we got a label submitted to us from one of the big Isla distilleries. And I can't tell you who yet because it is very unreleased and under embargo, but it's a whiskey created for us down here. And they put on the back label, for our Antipodean brethren, without you, we couldn't survive as Scotch distillers. And I
Aww.
never, which is incredibly sweet. I wish I could tell you which distillery it was because I think you'd really enjoy it. They I think correctly identified something that I'd never really considered, which is it's so hard to be a Scotch fan on the other side of the planet. Geographically, whiskey has to travel the furthest to get
Mm-hmm.
to us, and it's not innately simple. And Australia specifically has the heritage of having the first ever official single malt club,
Mm.
which is insane. But of course, you didn't need a single malt club when you lived in Inverness. It was down the street. But there's a history of Scottish doctors moving to Australia to do their country service in the 1970s, packing their bags full of unblended Lefroy, as it was called at the time, and sharing it and starting little communities. And I think there's actually a real hub in that side of it. Oh, I have imported this myself. It was a real struggle. I've gotten it to it, and I'm going to take it to a barbecue with my friends, and I'm going to share it with everyone. And we're not going to worry about how much it costs. We're just going to enjoy some
Mm-hmm.
wonderful jams. And I think that's actually the little nugget that makes the Australian New Zealand whiskey love so memorable and so specific. No other country has that kind of whiskey consumption. And I say that as someone that sits in a lot of marketing and brand analysis and country analysis meetings. No one consumes whiskey like we do on this side of the planet. And I think it's a really healthy to carry that into the innovation that we're now seeing in New Zealand and Australian whiskey. I mean, if you go back to the reinvigoration of Australian whiskey after the mega distilleries kind of closed down in the 70s, you very quickly get to Bill Lark, starting
Mm-hmm.
the Tasmanian whiskey industry and the new Australian whiskey industry in 1992. And Bill's a perfect example of, he was a Scotch diehard. He loved
Mm-hmm.
it. He was a member of a local whiskey club. They imported their own whiskies. They shared them as a community. It was exactly that moment that made him go, why aren't we doing this here? And I
Mm.
think that moment is one that, I mean, Bill was incredible for influencing hundreds of people around Australia to do the same, and a few folks in New Zealand. But then there are plenty of New Zealand whiskey makers, I think, that have done exactly that, whether it's Waiheke, whether it's Cardrona, who have looked at the land around them and thought, you know what, this isn't that different to Scotland. I think we could do some of this incredibly well.
Mm.
And I mean, the results speak for themselves, don't they?
Well, and I think part of that third wave piece is that the conversation has moved really distinctly. And I can speak for the New Zealand market. I mean, a little bit, I can speak for Australia too, where the conversation is now less about how do we make Scotch style whiskey here. It's now how do we make whiskey here, knowing having learned what we can from Scotland, but now actually making whiskey that is of our place and of our people and of our climate. And that particularly is a really strong thread and story with Pocono,
Yes.
the whiskey of Middle Earth. Yes, there it is. There it is. We can do these things because by the time this plays, the embargo's lifted. So the ring bearer, delicious. But I think part of when I was talking with Matt about the development of that whiskey from Pocono, how do you, for him, how did he continue with his philosophy of we're making whiskey that has to sit, it has to be from our place, it has to sit within our values, it has to sit within what we're trying to do, which is represent New Zealand, but also still have that broad appeal. And I think it's very similar, the emergence of Manuka smoke as a category, the use of Manuka, and that really now becoming a sophisticated piece with
Mm,
Waiheke whiskey, the fact that their use of peat, New Zealand South Island peat is very distinctive. It's forest driven, it's earth driven, as opposed to bog and coastal. There's that distinction between coastal peat in Scotland and Highland peat in Scotland. We now have South Island peat, we've got North Island peat, we've got coastal, we've got other pieces that are going on. All of which to say, that's the beautiful maturity of the industry, right? That it's now not just about how do we replicate, but actually how do we create ownership around our own. I'm so interested. It was big rambly chat piece, but I'm so interested in what you highlight around our compulsion to gather. And that actually spirits as a way of bringing people together, as a way of meeting together, is actually older than the tradition of whiskey itself. And it is something that I think you see paralleled through cultures. So while we
yeah.
barely ever talk about American whiskey, when we're talking about the Whiskey Club, I will talk about every phenomenal ingrained experience of American whiskey that I've had,
Mm.
foundational and formational, has always started with the bottle on the table, the cork is popped, and the cork goes, right? Because if you take a bottle of bourbon, it's just me and my lived experience, Guy. But you take a bottle of bourbon to a barbecue or to a gathering, and the expectation is that it's there to be enjoyed by everybody, and you'll finish it, right? However long it takes you. And I think there's very similar stories that you hear from back in the days of old, where actually you ordered a jug of whiskey for the table at the inn, and it was direct from cask down in the cellar. And yeah, but there's something about that gathering together and the way that we drink when we drink together that is, I think, really important.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think whiskey is always one of those categories that probably has the risk of becoming pretentious, and
I
I
like that
think
you're
that's a
calling it a
really
risk. Like
yeah.
like that horse didn't bolt in certain parts of the industry decades ago.
That very
Wow.
fair, very, very fair. But I think the joy in it, and it's the same with beer and with wine, the best bits are when it's completely, almost belligerently unpretentious, and
Mm,
there is just an aggressive acceptance of any point of view. It really yields better whiskey, better community, and better conversation. And whether that is opening a bottle, throwing away the cork, and having a great time around a big table, or it is just having an open dialogue as whiskey makers. I mean, I've seen so much across the New Zealand and Australian whiskey industry of whiskey makers getting together, having some beers and sharing ideas as well. And that community not only is into the consumption of it, but is also into the creation of it. Um,
mm,
I think that it doesn't set us apart because Scotland does that so well, but it has just created this extra Australian and New Zealand twist on it. And I think ultimately our industry, like any whiskey industry, is absolutely a result of the wealth of resources around it. So Scotch forever was sherry cask matured because goodness knows how many sherry casks they had easy access to. And then when America was getting rid of all of its ex-bourbons, Scotch became ex-bourbon matured. And when people started buying less Scotch, Scotch became about age statements. And all of those little incremental growths that Scotch has had over the last 100 years have really changed the way that I think a lot of people perceive whiskey. But similarly, I think Australian whiskey is born of having squat stills and small budgets and trying to make sure that they create really viscous distillate and really chewy whiskies, and then utilizing the cask resource that only Australia has, which is these hundreds of years old port
mm,
casks from local vineyards, and the incredible depth that that has. And yes, age statements are a little more inattainable for a climate like that of Australia, but the unique wealth of resource and therefore the predominant Australian style is showing off the Australian fortified wine production through a whiskey lens. And similarly, New Zealand showing off wine or showing off native woods, as Matt's doing with coconut, is a really interesting way of twisting, or with the Manuka, is a really interesting way of showing off what makes New Zealand whiskey incredibly unique as well. And I think now we're at a scale where some of those ideas are becoming pervasive and commercially viable. We can start giving them to people who would usually reach for a $90 scotch. We can
Mm.
give them a $90 local whiskey that really meets the standard and quality of a scotch, but is a very unique twist on the profile.
As you're talking, because a lot of this is, best jobs in whiskey. I think one of the best jobs in whiskey is obviously getting to do what you do and play with, so many different makers and then bring things to people who are enthusiastic about trying them. But part of that job, and I'd be interested in your take on it or your experience of it, is from my position, I look at what you guys do with the Whiskey Club and I think what an incredible position of influence and encouragement to be able to gently nudge drinkers into trying things that otherwise they wouldn't,
Mm.
but also to give them that kind of comfort and reassurance of, hey, here's how it used to be. And actually, that's a little bit about what I love about the Cabochon, right? Is that this is a little bit of, hey, this is actually how whiskey used to be. Or this is one of the seasons, because Scotch has been through how many identity crises, as you just listed so well. Um, it's always crisis that brings the Scotch whiskey industry together and enables them to move forward even stronger. But yeah, I think that's a really, is there a place where you consider the Whiskey Club in role of shepherd and guide and educator, and how you engage with your customers?
Yeah, I think we're incredibly lucky on both sides, and for anyone who sits in my chair, I think it's almost mandatory to host events and to talk directly
Mm,
with the members to have that kind of intimate dialogue. Because if you can't explain it to one person, you definitely can't explain it to 40,000 people. But I think we really do have an opportunity to, because everyone has an account. We know what you like. We can kind of say, all right, you really like this. So we think you'll be really interested to try this. And that's such a unique capability. But it also feeds both ways, because we can also go to whiskey makers and have really informed dialogue with them instead of sitting across the table from a Dr. Bill Lumsden and saying, we want a sherry cask. We can say, hey, here's what we've heard people are really excited about. Here's what our members are telling us. Here's the conversations we're having every day with them. What do you think about that? And the responses we've gotten from whiskey makers have been so incredibly interesting. I think sometimes there's a risk of markets maybe acting like a bit of a copyright stamp and saying like, this region is into bourbon casks, this region is into sherry casks, this region,
yeah,
you know,
yeah.
you would have heard as much as me, like France is into bourbon casks, Taiwan's into sherry casks, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm,
America loves virgin oak.
yeah.
Um,
China
which
likes red wine. Yeah.
China likes Fred. Yeah, and these are two broader statements. And I think the interesting conversation with the whiskey makers that we really uniquely get to have is to really connect the dot and say,
Mm,
here's what a bunch of whiskey drinkers really think, and your stocks, and let's have a conversation that brings us in the middle. And it's not just let's get a big fat PX sherry cask, but like let's get something that you think really shows off some of that really cool DNA that will kind of change some minds or reintroduce people or introduce people to new things. Um, and that's ultimately our job. I mean, when Bertie and Emily founded the Whiskey Club in 2014, it was on the original concept of bringing whiskey makers to your doorstep. And in at the time, Tasmanian hub, very small members, it was a faraway concept to imagine having any whiskey makers either directly in conversation or indirectly through a bottle actually be
mm.
communicating with you. Now it's every month, and it's grown incredibly, I think, because people feel heard in their preferences as much as anything.
In the 13 months that the Whiskey Club's been operating in New Zealand,
Mm.
and obviously without opening the book on the data, but are there some high level observations or anecdotes about what New Zealanders have loved, what they're curious about?
Yes, absolutely. High levels. These are broad strokes and they don't apply to everyone, of course. But I can say broadly, Australian members are far more interested in Irish whiskey than their New
Mm,
Zealand counterparts.
hmm Well, that makes sense though, right? Because history is history and genealogy is genealogy.
Exactly, exactly. And look, you're sat on this call with someone called Seamus Carroll with an Australian accent. So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but the real exciting difference that I've seen is in a lot of ways, the brands and the distilleries that have had less exposure in New Zealand have been the ones that people have gotten the most excited about,
Mm,
which is great. There's such an adventurous spirit there. And I think because Australia often gets so much of the antipodean marketing focus, sometimes New Zealand doesn't get enough from the bigger distilling groups and the smaller distilling groups who are worse on resource. Which means if we arrive with a Tamdu, for example, people get incredibly excited. They go, "Oh wow, I've seen this, but I haven't seen this in my local bottle shop enough yet. I haven't tried enough of this yet." And being able to say, all right, well, if you really enjoy a Glendronach or a Macallan, you should try this Tamdu. It's going to resonate with a lot of what you really enjoy. So we've seen a real explosion of that in New Zealand, which is really exciting. And I think a lot of it is also the great work that the Law guys have done, building some of those smaller community brands. Not just them, there's some terrific importers around New Zealand that are building smaller
mm,
bases of really noisy advocate kind of geek brands.
mm.
And yeah, they really take storm, um, almost more than their multinational counterparts, which is great and really healthy.
Yeah. Every conversation that I've had with distributors in the last little while here in New Zealand has been almost all about either allocation, so there's desire for stock, but they just can't get it in, or the other challenge, which is A&P. And it's really challenging to come into market with a really small line for advertising and promotion. So really great brands that would love to get a foothold, but they just, you've got to spend the money to connect with people, you know?
Yeah.
Not advertising dollars, it's connecting with people is the piece. What about the relationship between Australian and New Zealand whiskies? Because obviously you've done a great job with Pocono, and I know that Pocono feels like as a New Zealand emissary whiskey has done a pretty good job in Australia so far. Would that be
Yeah,
yeah?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. It's very well loved amongst the Australian membership as well as the New Zealand.
Do you think that the New Zealand audience is ready for an influx of Australian whiskey?
We're choosing selectively. We're choosing selectively. Influx is absolutely the wrong word, but I think it is worth introducing some of what we see as the best Australian whiskey
Mm,
into some curious New Zealand hands is absolutely worth doing. You can expect to see some real pioneering whiskey styles from probably distilleries that New Zealand members will be familiar with, and also distilleries that New Zealand members won't be familiar with, but think we'll be really impressed by. And Tash, if I'm not wrong, I think you'll be visiting a few of those distilleries next week.
Well, there's every possibility during Tas Whiskey Week that I will find myself in one or two pockets. You know, I have my favorites. I'm clear about which ones my favorites are. So, well, we'll see how that goes. Maybe matchy matchy. I don't know. I don't think I'm brave enough to write a whiskey trends of the future book, but I certainly know which horses I'd like to back in a race. We might say. Before we wrap up, it's been so great. Just to kind of talk through some of the actual ins and outs of an incredible job in whiskey. What's the favorite thing that you've done in your job this week? The moment that stands
Wow.
out. You know.
Well, I mean, having had Rachel Barry in the office going through car samples, I feel like it's this week specifically is a very easy answer.
True.
we
True.
uh, we have just assessed the next 4 years of car samples from Benrick, Glenglasser, and Glendronach, and there is some stunning casks that Rachel is working on. It is incredible to have dialogues with a whiskey maker like that. So I will give that as my answer. It is an incredibly easy answer, and I'm sorry I haven't given you a higher brow one, but there
What a
are still
flex,
those
bro.
pinch me
What a flex.
moments. Look, I say this as a fan, as an
Hmm.
absolute diehard geek. I've got a Glenglasser tattoo. I'm a nerd for those distilleries. So it's as a drinker, it's still a pinch me moment.
That's pretty cool. Okay, I accept your answer. I accept your answer. The one whiskey that you currently can't get out of your head,
Ooh,
and you do not have to answer on brand. You can go anywhere you like with this.
I know, I know. Goodness, this is such a big question. Pause for computation. I'm looking around at all the distilleries around me. Oh, okay. I say this as someone who also hunts through options for very historic bottlings of distilleries I love. I'm absolutely obsessed with the evolving peat profile at the Benriach distillery. For anyone who's a bit of a Benriach drinker, Benriach did peat runs because Pernod Ricard, or the owners of Benriach, Ali, Dominique at the time, have an Isla distillery. So they had to do their peating in Speyside. So in 75, 85, 94, Benriach did pretty heavy peated runs. But each time they actually changed their peat source. And that means the barley profile in each of the whiskeys tastes really different. And having now seen some of the kind of mid 2010s, Rachel has obviously, or Billy and Rachel have obviously identified this and are still doing peated production, but it really harkens back to specific eras with specific cuts. So I'm absolutely obsessed with a Ben Rare car sample that's just come across that I cannot get out of my head. Don't think it's want for us. I think it was more of a crazy idea that Rachel will do something with of her own volition, but for anyone who's curious, like 1980s Benriach peat had this like iron bark, metallic barbecue sauce kind of note to it. It's so weird. And this car sample had that as well. And it's just so cool.
I don't think you could have chosen a better, more enticing and yet unreachable anecdote.
I'm
But that's
sorry. I'm
great.
sorry.
Don't apologize. Like, this is one of the reasons why what you do in whiskey is pretty awesome. I don't know how long the succession line is behind your chair, but I imagine it's probably out the door and around the block a few times by now.
I think there's about 40,000 people that are up for it and are in the line of succession. So we'll see how they go. Um, it's It's absolute honor to be asked to do this with you, by the way, Tash. I really appreciate it. As much as this job is full of pinch me moments, I did not think I would be anywhere close to having the best job in whiskey, but it is a very fun job.
That's so good. Actually, before I let you go, is there anything in whiskey that you haven't done yet that you want to do?
Um, Absolutely. Yeah. This is kind of born of the fact that the club is founded in 2014. We don't quite have the lineage. But,
Mm.
we've seen a lot of whiskey projects through where we kind of worked on cast selections and finishing 5 years before release and saw them really develop and grow. But we're still yet to release anything that we identified as fantastic at a spirit level from Scotland. And I would love to really see something from top to tail with the distillery, let it get to a real maturation, and then release it and kind of know its whole journey from being there, days of still runs all the way through to release, and being able to share that with the world.
That sounds like a pretty epic next goal. We'll put that in your KPIs for sometime in the next 5 years. All right. Well, very much looking forward to having a dram, one or two with you this week for Taz Whiskey Week. Thanks so much, Seamus.
Cannot wait to catch up, Tash. It'll be absolutely wonderful. And yeah, see you and anyone else who's visiting down here for Tassie Whiskey Week.
Uh, all right.